This is God and Autobiography, the podcast, a dramatic adaptation and continuing discussion of the book God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher by Jerry L. Martin. He was a lifelong agnostic, but one day he had an occasion to pray. To his vast surprise, God answered in words. Being a philosopher, he had a lot of questions, and God had a lot to tell him. Episode 216. Welcome to God and Autobiography, the podcast. I'm Scott Langdon. This week, Jerry breaks down his encounter with God, where the two have a conversation about the very difficult story of Abraham and his only son Isaac, and God's desire to have Abraham sacrifice the boy. At first, the story might seem to have only one meaning: obedience. But is that all there is to it? Join Jerry as he reveals some of the further context of this discussion with God in our latest edition of From God to Jerry to You. Here now is Jerry Martin. I hope you enjoy the episode.
The least favorite part for readers of God and Autobiography is when we come to the story of Abraham and Isaac. Obedience is not a popular topic these days. And in this story, Abraham is told to go to a mountaintop and sacrifice his son Isaac, whom we are told he loved. First thing the next morning, no more discussion between Abraham and God. Go sacrifice your son at the mountain. Promptly the next morning, he leaves with his son, heading toward the mountain. He's going to do it. They reach the designated location. Abraham places his puzzled son, who doesn't know what on earth is going on. You can imagine the kid's feelings, and he is later, comes up in the story again. He's placed on that kind of rocky altar. Abraham raises his sword. He's going to do it. What kind of horrible story is this? This is supposed to be a sacred text. Well, at the last moment, the very last moment, God countermands his order. Do not harm your son. Well, this is a very strange story and kind of horrible story. And so we wonder, what is going on here? What could God possibly be up to? We want to give God the benefit of the doubt, but how can we do that in such a story? Well, there have been various interpretations of this story. So I asked, is obedience to God the lesson, the moral of the story? And the answer I received was, yes, exactly. The structure of the world and of the spiritual development of the world requires absolute obedience, total yielding. God goes on in explaining this to me. You see, it is a matter of principle. Anything held back is a sacrilege, a defiant act, a claiming to possess a thing or a right to a thing or an authority over oneself that one does not have, hence an illegitimate act. Yielding is essential to the spiritual development of the universe and of you and of me. Well, in my dialogue with God, I say, kill my son. If you told me to do that, I would not believe it was you speaking. And God replies, of course, I would not command such a thing, but only the extreme example is sufficient to drive home the point of obedience and of divine dominion being total. Well, revisiting this episode, I understood why readers, had trouble with it. In fact, even at this point, after all that discussion, I found myself still unsettled. Something is missing from this story. And so I started looking around other parts of God and autobiography to see if there's any other point in which in my dialogues with God in which the question of obedience or things that might shed light on this Abraham and Isaac story uh, might be found. And I did find some bits of dialogue that help, I think. At one point, before I prayed about Abraham, in fact, I was told about myself. God said to Jerry, you need purification. Transformation is a good word. It is obedience, which at its fullest is transformation. And at that time, I asked, I again didn't have Abraham on my mind. I was just God telling me, I need purification, transformation, obedience. And so I asked, what does that involve, Lord? Putting me first rather than last, living every moment, making every decision in response to my call, not just to do it mechanically, like a soldier following orders, but to do it as an organic flow, wishing to be in touch with me and to live in accord with my will, my love. Well, I found that I'd forgotten this passage in my dialogues, but that is interesting. I mean, what I'm being told here is that God's will is the same as God's love. Well, that's kind of a puzzling. I'd never thought of that before. As soon as I thought about it, it made sense. It's what you want for someone you love. It's like a loving parent who admonishes the child, don't play with knives. I found another passage that goes down to basics, valuing individual self-expression in our day and time, and we all do that. We would like to follow our own will rather than God's, rather than some will from outside, some authority figure. Well, I'm asked in prayer at one point, what are these the alternatives? My will, God's will? And I'm told, people want God's will to conform to theirs. Others try to conform their will to God's. But at root, the two are the same. I do not have some arbitrary plan and then demand obedience to it. I want nothing other than your fulfillment. That is what you want too. Well, I think that does make sense. To go back to our earlier example, the child may want to play with knives, but does not actually want to be sliced. At a superficial level, the child and the parent are at odds. The parent is issuing orders to the child and maybe even punishment if the child does not obey. At a deeper level, they want the same thing. They both want an uncut child. So there's one other section that casts helpful light on the question of following God's will. It came up in the context of asking God what the overall goal was. And God replied, the goal, one way to describe the goal, is to be at one with God. At bottom, the soul's will is the will of God. We are at one in perfect harmony. It is the nature of what the soul is that it is at one with God. Well, I ask, to be at one with God, Does that mean like merging with the divine? Jumping in with a pure identity? But no, God responded. The shallow seeking of union with me is a delusion. The goal is to be in tune with me. It is coming into alignment with me, like two singers doing a harmony. Well, now obedience doesn't sound so horrible, does it? Yes, you have to follow God's lead, but it's the way a chorus follows the conductor, less like a boot camp and more like a music camp. Well, okay. I can go along with that. Maybe you can too.
Thank you for listening to God and Autobiography, the podcast. Subscribe for free today wherever you listen to your podcasts and hear a new episode every week. You can hear the complete dramatic adaptation of God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher by Jerry L. Martin by beginning with episode 1 of our podcast and listening through its conclusion with episode 44. You can read the original true story in the book from which this podcast is adapted, God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher, available now at Amazon.com and always at godandautobiography.com. Pick up your own copy today. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, please email us at questions@godandautobiography.com and experience the world from God's perspective, as it was told to a philosopher. This is Scott Langdon. I'll see you next time.